By the early summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Western Europe had become inevitable. Years of preparation, industrial mobilization, and strategic coordination converged on a narrow stretch of coastline in Normandy. For Allied leaders, the landings represented not only a military operation, but the moment when the war in Europe would decisively turn westward and begin moving toward its conclusion. The expectations surrounding the invasion were cautiously optimistic. The most dangerous phase was understood to be the assault itself. Once forces secured the beaches, Allied superiority in air power, naval fire support, manpower, and logistics was expected to translate into rapid movement inland. The German army in France appeared overstretched, short of reserves, and increasingly constrained by Allied control of the skies and the sea. Yet what followed the landings challenged those assumptions. The invasion succeeded, the beachheads held, and the Allies established a firm foothold in France. But the anticipated breakthrough did not occur quickly. Progress inland was slow, costly, and measured in villages and hedgerows rather than kilometers. Weeks passed without the kind of operational maneuver that planners had expected to follow the initial success. This gap between expectation and reality was not the result of a single failure or miscalculation. It emerged from the interaction of terrain, doctrine, logistics, command decisions, and enemy adaptation. The Normandy campaign revealed how even overwhelming material advantage could be constrained by conditions on the ground and by the limits of planning under combat conditions. Understanding why the breakthrough took so long requires moving beyond the drama of the landings themselves and examining the structure of the campaign that followed. Normandy was not decided on the beaches alone. It was shaped by what happened after success, when victory seemed close but remained elusive. The Allied landing in Normandy was planned as the opening move of a rapid continental campaign. By 1944, Allied planners expected that once forces secured the beaches, operational momentum would shift decisively inland. The central assumption was that German resistance, already weakened by years of attrition and constrained by Allied control of the air and sea, would not be able to prevent a swift breakout into open terrain. This assumption shaped every aspect of planning. The invasion was designed to establish multiple beachheads quickly, link them together, and then push armored and mechanized formations through the initial line of resistance. Speed was considered essential. Allied doctrine emphasized maintaining pressure, exploiting gaps, and preventing the enemy from stabilizing a defensive front. The longer German forces were given to reorganize, the greater the risk that the campaign would become slow and costly. From a strategic standpoint, the logic was sound. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in manpower, logistics, and firepower. Naval forces could deliver sustained support along the coast. Air forces could interdict German movement, disrupt reinforcements, and isolate the battlefield. Supply lines across the Channel were expected to expand steadily, allowing continuous reinforcement and resupply. In this framework, the beach assault was the most dangerous phase. Once overcome, the path inland appeared open. German defenses were assessed accordingly. While the Atlantic Wall was formidable in places, intelligence suggested that it was unevenly manned and that German reserves were limited. Many experienced units had been drawn east, and those remaining in France were believed to lack mobility and fuel. Allied planners expected that once the initial defensive belt was breached, German forces would be unable to mount a coherent, sustained resistance in depth. These expectations influenced operational priorities. Emphasis was placed on securing ports, road networks, and junctions that would facilitate rapid movement. The goal was not merely to hold ground, but to transition quickly from amphibious assault to maneuver warfare. Normandy was viewed as a gateway rather than a battlefield in its own right. What this planning did not fully account for was the interaction between terrain, force density, and defensive adaptation. The region beyond the beaches was not open country suited to rapid exploitation. It was compartmentalized, restrictive, and capable of absorbing pressure. German forces, though constrained, were not static. They retained the ability to improvise, concentrate locally, and exploit the defensive advantages offered by the landscape. The Allied plan relied on momentum as a substitute for uncertainty. Speed was expected to compensate for friction, confusion, and incomplete information. When momentum slowed, the assumptions underpinning the campaign were exposed. The invasion succeeded, but success did not immediately translate into freedom of movement. This disconnect between expectation and outcome defined the early phase of the Normandy campaign. The beaches were secured, but the breakthrough did not follow on schedule. What had been planned as a rapid transition became a prolonged struggle to generate operational space, setting the conditions for a campaign that would test the limits of Allied superiority. The first obstacle to rapid Allied progress inland was not German strength in the abstract, but the physical environment in which the campaign unfolded. Beyond the beaches of Normandy, Allied forces entered a landscape that fundamentally constrained movement, visibility, and coordination. The region was dominated by the bocage, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, small fields, and irregular terrain that fragmented the battlefield into countless enclosed compartments. This terrain neutralized many of the advantages on which Allied planning relied. Armored units could not maneuver freely. Long-range firepower was difficult to employ effectively. Lines of sight were short, often measured in tens of meters rather than kilometers. Each field, lane, and village became a separate tactical problem, requiring deliberate clearance before movement could continue. For attacking forces, this imposed a significant operational penalty. Units advancing from the beaches were compressed into narrow corridors, slowing the flow of men and supplies. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support became more complex. Progress was no longer a matter of breakthrough and exploitation, but of sequential reduction of defensive positions embedded within the terrain itself. German forces adapted quickly to these conditions. Although outnumbered and under constant pressure, elements of the Wehrmacht exploited the defensive potential of the bocage with considerable skill. Small units established mutually supporting positions, using hedgerows as natural fortifications. Movement between positions could be concealed, while attackers were forced to expose themselves when crossing open ground. This defensive adaptation did not require large reserves or operational mobility. It relied on local initiative, familiarity with the terrain, and the ability to impose delay disproportionate to force size. German units were able to slow Allied advances not by counterattacking at scale, but by forcing attackers to fight repeatedly on unfavorable terms. The density of forces further compounded the problem. The Allied buildup in Normandy placed enormous numbers of troops, vehicles, and supplies into a limited area. While this concentration was necessary to sustain the invasion, it reduced flexibility. Roads became congested. Command posts operated under constant pressure. Any delay at the front reverberated backward through the entire system. Air superiority, a central pillar of Allied planning, proved less decisive in this environment. While Allied aircraft dominated the skies, their ability to influence combat in the bocage was limited. Targets were difficult to identify from the air. Friendly and enemy positions were often intermingled. Close air support risked collateral damage and friendly fire, forcing cautious employment and reducing its immediacy. As a result, the campaign's tempo slowed. Advances were measured in hundreds of meters rather than rapid thrusts. Each gain required time, coordination, and attrition. What had been envisioned as a brief transitional phase became a grinding process of accumulation and adjustment. This early encounter with terrain-driven resistance did not represent a failure of the invasion itself. It represented the collision between operational expectation and environmental reality. The Allies had secured the beaches, but they had not yet secured the conditions necessary for maneuver. and without maneuver, breakthrough remained elusive. As the campaign extended beyond the initial landings, the limits of Allied command and control became increasingly apparent. The invasion had been planned with remarkable coordination at the strategic level, but the transition to sustained ground combat exposed friction between doctrine, organization, and battlefield reality. What slowed the breakthrough was not a lack of effort, but the difficulty of aligning multiple armies, commands, and priorities within a constrained battle space. Allied ground forces in Normandy operated under a complex command structure designed to manage a coalition war. This structure worked effectively for planning and logistics, but it imposed constraints on operational flexibility once fighting intensified. Decision-making required coordination across national lines, service branches, and hierarchical levels, each with its own procedures and risk tolerances. Adjustments that seemed tactically obvious often required time to implement at scale. The density of forces amplified these challenges. Large formations were committed into a narrow front, limiting room for maneuver and increasing the importance of sequencing. Advances by one unit depended on the progress of adjacent formations. Delays propagated laterally, slowing the entire front. Commanders were forced to balance pressure with cohesion, often choosing methodical advance over risky exploitation. At the operational level, Allied doctrine emphasized maintaining continuous contact and building pressure, rather than executing deep penetrations without secured flanks. This approach reduced the risk of isolation, but also limited the speed of advance. In the bocage environment, opportunities for rapid exploitation were rare and difficult to recognize in real time. When gaps did appear, moving sufficient force through them quickly enough proved challenging. German command practices, though constrained by limited resources, exploited this predictability. Local commanders focused on delay rather than decisive engagement, trading space for time and forcing the Allies to commit forces incrementally. Even when German units were compelled to withdraw, they often did so in a manner that preserved cohesion and re-established resistance further back. Logistical considerations further shaped command decisions. Supply lines from the beaches remained vulnerable and congested. Ammunition, fuel, and replacements had to be moved forward along limited routes under constant demand. Commanders were reluctant to accelerate operations beyond what the supply system could reliably support, reinforcing a deliberate tempo, even when tactical success suggested momentum. Intelligence added another layer of uncertainty. German dispositions were difficult to assess accurately within the compartmentalized terrain. Small units could exert outsized influence without revealing their full strength. This ambiguity encouraged caution and reinforced the preference for systematic reduction rather than rapid thrusts. The result was a campaign rhythm defined by accumulation rather than breakthrough. Gains were real and continuous, but they were achieved through pressure applied across the front rather than decisive penetration at a single point. This approach eventually proved effective, but it required time to mature and adapt to the realities of Normandy. By midsummer of 1944, it was increasingly clear that the delay was not temporary friction, but a structural feature of the campaign. The Allied command system was optimized for success at scale, not for speed under extreme constraint. And until those constraints were reduced, the long-awaited breakthrough would remain out of reach. While Allied progress was slowed by terrain and command friction, the persistence of German resistance in Normandy was shaped by a different set of structural factors. The German defense did not rely on the expectation of victory or decisive counterattack. It was designed to impose delay, absorb pressure, and deny the Allies the conditions necessary for rapid maneuver. This defensive logic proved effective precisely because it aligned with the environment in which the battle was being fought. German forces in Normandy operated under severe constraints. Fuel shortages limited mobility, air superiority denied freedom of movement, and reserves were scarce. Yet these limitations encouraged a defensive posture that emphasized economy of force and local initiative. Rather than concentrating units for large-scale engagements, German commanders dispersed their forces, anchoring them to terrain that favored defense and concealment. The bocage enabled this approach. Hedgerows provided natural cover, concealment, and firing positions. German units could defend from prepared positions, withdraw short distances, and re-establish resistance without requiring long movements. This pattern forced Allied forces to fight repeatedly for marginal gains, each one costing time and resources disproportionate to the ground taken. German command culture further reinforced this method. Local commanders were accustomed to operating with limited guidance and adapting to immediate conditions. In Normandy, this translated into a defensive elasticity that complicated Allied planning. Resistance was not uniform, but it was persistent. The absence of a single continuous defensive line made it difficult for the Allies to identify a decisive point of rupture. Crucially, German forces did not need to hold every position indefinitely. Their objective was not to prevent Allied advance entirely, but to slow it long enough to preserve strategic options elsewhere. Each day gained delayed the Allied buildup, strained logistics, and increased the cumulative cost of the campaign. Delay itself became a form of success. This defensive endurance was supported by selective reinforcement. Although German reserves were limited, they were committed carefully, often at moments when Allied forces appeared close to exploitation. These countermeasures were rarely decisive on their own, but they disrupted tempo and forced the Allies to reset operations. Even small, localized counterattacks could halt momentum long enough to stabilize the front. The German defense also benefited from Allied caution. The high density of forces and the risk of overextension encouraged methodical advance. This caution was rational, but it aligned unintentionally with German defensive objectives.
Each pause allowed defenders to reorganize, reposition, and prepare the next line of resistance. The persistence of German resistance in Normandy, therefore, did not reflect strength in the conventional sense. It reflected the effective use of terrain, doctrine, and time under conditions of inferiority. The defense worked not because it could win, but because it could delay. And delay was sufficient to deny the Allies a rapid breakthrough. By early summer, it was evident that the German defense had achieved its immediate aim. The Allied foothold was secure, but the conditions for maneuver had not yet been created. The campaign had become a contest of endurance and adaptation rather than speed, setting the stage for a shift in Allied methods that would eventually break the stalemate. By late June and early July of 1944, Allied commanders began to recognize that the campaign in Normandy could not be resolved through incremental pressure alone. The slow pace of advance was no longer viewed as temporary friction, but as a structural condition imposed by terrain, force density, and defensive adaptation. This recognition marked a shift in how the campaign was understood and how it would ultimately be fought. The initial operational concept had assumed that momentum would emerge naturally once the beachheads were secured. Instead, momentum had dissipated into a series of localized engagements that consumed time and resources without producing operational freedom. Allied forces were winning battles, but not generating space. This distinction became increasingly important as logistical demands grew and the need to exploit superiority became more urgent. Commanders faced a dilemma. Continuing the existing approach promised eventual progress, but at a pace that risked exhausting formations and extending the campaign well beyond initial estimates. Accelerating operations without changing conditions risked higher casualties without guaranteed gain.
The solution required altering the environment of the fight, rather than merely applying more pressure within it. This led to a reassessment of objectives. Rather than attempting to break through everywhere, Allied planners began focusing on creating a localized rupture, large enough to allow maneuver forces to operate beyond the bocage. This required massing combat power, accepting risk in some sectors, and concentrating effort in a way that had previously been avoided due to concerns about exposure and coordination. At the same time, adaptation occurred at the tactical level. Units developed new methods for dealing with hedgerows, integrating infantry, armor, and engineers more closely. These innovations did not produce immediate breakthroughs, but they reduced friction and increased the effectiveness of each advance. Learning accumulated unevenly, but it began to change the character of the fighting. German resistance continued to impose delay, but it was increasingly stretched. The very strategy that had succeeded in slowing the Allies depended on constant local engagement and rapid repositioning. As Allied pressure intensified and resources accumulated, German units faced mounting strain. Replacements were limited, equipment losses were difficult to recover, and the ability to respond flexibly began to erode. The campaign reached a point where continuation of the existing pattern no longer favored the defender. What had once imposed effective delay now risked attrition without compensation. German commanders recognized this shift, but lacked the reserves and mobility required to alter the situation decisively. By midsummer, the conditions for a different phase of the campaign were forming. The breakthrough had not occurred quickly, but the process of adaptation on the Allied side was beginning to produce the prerequisites for maneuver.
The delay had reshaped expectations, refined methods, and concentrated effort toward a decisive attempt that would finally break the constraints imposed by Normandy terrain. The decisive shift in the Normandy campaign came not from a sudden collapse of German resistance, but from the Allied ability to change the conditions that had constrained the fighting since the landings. By midsummer of 1944, the campaign entered a phase where accumulated pressure, adaptation, and concentration of force began to align in a way that made breakthrough possible. The critical change was operational focus. Allied planners accepted that the bocage could not be neutralized everywhere at once. Instead, they concentrated combat power in a limited sector with the explicit goal of creating space for maneuver rather than simply gaining ground. This marked a departure from the earlier emphasis on steady, front-wide advance and reflected a clearer understanding of what had been missing since the beaches were secured. This concentration required significant preparation. Artillery, armor, air support, and logistics were massed deliberately. Supply systems were expanded and stabilized to support high-intensity operations. Units were rested and reorganized where possible. The aim was not speed for its own sake, but the creation of overwhelming local superiority sufficient to rupture the defensive pattern that had held for weeks. German forces, by contrast, were reaching the limits of their defensive strategy. The method of trading space for time depended on the ability to reposition, reinforce, and recover. By this stage, those options were narrowing. Continuous pressure, losses, and lack of replacements reduced cohesion. Defensive positions could still delay, but they could no longer reset as effectively after contact. When the breakthrough attempt was launched, its success was not immediate or effortless. Resistance remained stiff, and losses continued. What changed was the scale of effect. Once a breach widened beyond the confines of the hedgerow terrain, Allied forces finally gained the room required for maneuver. Armor could operate with fewer restrictions, coordination improved, and the advantages that had been muted since the landings began to assert themselves. This moment validated the earlier delay without justifying it. The breakthrough succeeded because the Allies adapted, not because time alone solved the problem. The weeks of slow fighting had revealed the nature of the battlefield and forced a rethinking of methods. Victory came not from persistence alone, but from learning applied at scale. For German forces, the loss of the bocage defensive environment was decisive. Once forced into more open terrain, their disadvantages in mobility, fuel, and air cover became overwhelming. The defensive logic that had been effective in Normandy no longer applied. Delay gave way to retreat, and cohesion deteriorated rapidly under sustained pressure. The long-awaited breakout did not mark the end of the campaign, but it ended its defining constraint. the war in Western Europe finally transitioned from containment to movement. What had been impossible in June became unavoidable by late summer, not because the Allies were stronger in absolute terms, but because the structure of the fight had changed. The breakthrough took so long because it required more than success at the beaches. It required reshaping the battlefield itself, aligning force, method, and environment in a way that allowed superiority to function as intended. The Normandy campaign left a set of lessons that extended well beyond the summer of 1944. What the battle demonstrated most clearly was not the inevitability of Allied victory, but the conditions under which superiority becomes effective.
Normandy showed that advantage in numbers, firepower, and resources does not automatically translate into speed, and that operational success depends on alignment between plan, environment, and method. For Allied commanders, the campaign reinforced the limits of pre-war and early wartime assumptions. Planning had emphasized decisive moments and rapid transitions, but Normandy required sustained adaptation under constraint. The experience shifted emphasis toward flexibility, combined arms integration at the lowest levels, and acceptance that operational tempo is shaped as much by terrain and friction as by intent. This adjustment had immediate effects on subsequent operations. The lessons learned in Normandy influenced how Allied forces approached later phases of the campaign in France and beyond. Greater attention was paid to logistics flow, unit rotation, and the creation of conditions for maneuver before committing to large-scale exploitation. The expectation of rapid collapse gave way to a more measured understanding of how modern armies resist pressure. The German experience offered a different but equally instructive lesson. Defensive success in Normandy did not stem from strength, but from alignment between method and environment. German forces exploited terrain and delay effectively, but their approach depended on conditions that could not be sustained indefinitely. Once those conditions were altered, the defense unraveled quickly, revealing the fragility beneath its apparent endurance. Normandy also clarified the role of time in modern warfare. Delay can be operationally effective even when defeat is inevitable. By slowing Allied progress, German forces imposed costs, shaped timelines, and influenced decisions at higher levels.
At the same time, delay without the prospect of recovery ultimately magnified loss, as resources were consumed without altering the strategic outcome. For the broader conduct of the war, Normandy became a reference point for understanding how campaigns evolve after initial success. Securing entry into enemy territory was only the first step. What followed mattered more, and required different skills, expectations, and tolerances. The campaign demonstrated that victory is often determined not at the moment of breakthrough, but in the period when breakthrough fails to materialize. In this sense, Normandy was less a single battle than a process of adjustment. It exposed the gap between expectation and reality, forced adaptation on both sides, and reshaped how power was applied. The delay was not an anomaly, but a product of the interaction between forces, terrain, and doctrine. By the time the campaign moved beyond Normandy, Allied superiority was no longer in question. What had changed was the understanding of how that superiority had to be used. The breakthrough finally came not because the enemy weakened suddenly, but because the Allies learned how to create the conditions in which their advantages could finally operate as intended. The Normandy campaign concludes, not with a moment of sudden release, but with a clarified understanding of how modern war unfolds after initial success. The Allied landings achieved their immediate objective, but the delay that followed revealed the difference between gaining access to the battlefield and controlling it. Normandy demonstrated that victory is not determined by entry alone, but by the ability to reshape conditions once resistance adapts. The long wait for breakthrough was not the result of hesitation or failure of will. It emerged from the interaction of terrain, force density, defensive method,
and logistical constraint.
The Allies possessed overwhelming resources, yet those resources required space, time, and coordination to function effectively. Until those conditions were created, superiority remained latent rather than decisive. Normandy showed that planning cannot eliminate friction, only anticipate it, imperfectly. Even the most carefully prepared operation encounters realities that resist prediction. The true test of strategy lies not in the initial plan, but in the capacity to adjust when assumptions no longer hold. In this respect, the Normandy campaign was a demonstration of institutional learning under pressure. For German forces, the campaign illustrated the limits of delay as a strategic tool. Defensive adaptation extended the fight and imposed cost, but it could not reverse the balance of power. Once the environment shifted and maneuver became possible, the defensive system collapsed rapidly. Delay succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. The broader significance of Normandy lies in its clarification of cause and effect. The breakthrough took so long, not because the Allies lacked strength, but because strength alone does not determine tempo. Terrain can absorb power, command systems can slow action, and defensive methods can impose friction, even under conditions of inferiority. Understanding these interactions is essential to understanding the campaign itself. Normandy also reshaped expectations for the remainder of the war. It tempered optimism, refined doctrine, and reinforced the importance of integration across domains. The experience influenced how subsequent operations were planned and executed, reducing reliance on assumptions of rapid collapse and increasing emphasis on preparation and convergence. In final assessment, the Normandy campaign was not a failure of execution, but a correction of expectation. The landings opened the way into Western Europe, but the path beyond them had to be created deliberately and at cost. The breakthrough came when conditions aligned, not when desire was greatest. The delay that followed the landings was therefore not an anomaly to be explained away, but the central feature of the campaign. Normandy reminds us that in modern war, victory often depends less on dramatic beginnings than on the ability to adapt when progress slows and the outcome remains uncertain.